on the present danger China. We appreciate your interest in our weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for information on new programs, access to videos of our past webinars, and tons of other very valuable content. Please subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPDChina. For today's webinar, select the Q&A from your navigation bar to make comments or ask questions, and open up the chat for important resources we will share. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is president of the Institute for the American Future, vice chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America on Real America's Voice Network. Frank, let's get started. In 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Dee Dee, and welcome everyone to this edition of our weekly examination of the lines of attack of the Chinese Communist Party and its unrestricted warfare against our country. We are going to be talking about a line that is the product of years of effort by the CCP to affect not just America and its security interests, but also those of our very important ally on the Korean Peninsula, South Korea. This presentation, this conversation, is occasioned by the election on the 3rd of June of an individual who I think we will be discussing in considerable detail today in terms of his, background, his political leanings, his policy predilections. And in so doing, we will have an opportunity to take stock as to whether Lee Jae-myung was the winner of the election in South Korea for the presidency, or whether, in fact, it was his ally and enabler, Xi Jinping. We'll be talking about that against the backdrop of the Tiananmen Square massacre, which also was commemorated on the 3rd of June. It was, of course, a moment when the Chinese Communist Party snuffed the aspirations for freedom of its own people, demonstrated by the vast number that were in Tiananmen Square on the occasion, but also others around China, many of whom lost their lives as a result of the determined efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to crush that rebellion. This particular event in South Korea, of course, was bloodless, and yet it may prove to be as ominous as what the Chinese did to their people, because it will affect, as I said, not just the people of South Korea, but quite possibly people far beyond as well. We'll be talking about, among other things, the evidence that the Chinese may have had a hand in the election outcome in the election just completed. They certainly have been involved deeply, as we'll discuss, in South Korean affairs for years, as have their puppets in North Korea. And the alignment between China on the one hand and the regime of Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang with President Lee historically and presumably going forward is the stuff of a very, very serious strategic realignment, a tectonic shift, if you will. And as with geological tectonic shifts, there may be some, tidal wave, tsunami elsewhere that will profoundly affect interests of the free world and in particular those of the United States, quite profoundly. We're going to examine all of that with another of our all-star casts. Many of those are men that are familiar contributors to these programs, for which we are very grateful indeed. We will also be, as we often do, taking some of their inputs via videotape. But we're going to start with a man who is certainly no stranger, one of our most faithful members of the Committee on the Present Danger of China when it comes to his participations in these programs. And it's all the more laudable and appreciated that not infrequently it involves him being up in the wee hours of the morning, his time, on the other side of the world when we do these programs. His name is Colonel Grant Newsham, United States Marine Corps retired. I'm fond of pointing out that he has the distinction of having also served as a Foreign Service officer in the U.S. Embassy in Japan. He's been a businessman, an entrepreneur in East Asia for many years as well. He is these days a senior fellow of the Center for Security Policy and the author of an extraordinarily important and I think very well received best-selling book entitled When China Attacks, a Warning to America. Colonel Newsham has been forward deployed, not just in the region, but actually in South Korea in the days leading up to and shortly after the election. He was part of an important delegation, I think supporting our friend Steve Bannon's reporting on what was happening in South Korea on the War Room pandemic program. Also doing their level best to try to make sure that, to the extent one could, monitor at the very least, if not minimize the chances of electoral fraud in the course of this campaign. Colonel Newsham is going to tackle for us the question of who won this election, an eyewitness, in fact, as he was to Xi's win, I'm going to argue, how it happened, and where were we? Colonel Newsham, welcome back. The floor is yours, sir.
Sure. Thanks for having me, Frank. I'll sort of get to the bottom of this, or the conclusion straight away. Was there fraud in the South Korean election that affected the outcome of it? In fact, determined the outcome of it? Yes, it was about as much as there would have been in an old Mayor Richard Daley Chicago. Probably a lot more, actually. It was that bad. And now I'll go work through this and give you a little background here. What you're seeing ultimately is an effort by hardcore, committed, very ruthless South Korean radicals, leftist radicals, who see North Korea, who see China as the country that South Korea should be aligned to, and they don't like the U.S. South Korea relationship. They actually want to end it. It's an effort by these people to ultimately establish a one-party state. The election the other day was just the last step, or it was almost the last step towards that goal. It's not the end, but it got them pretty close by getting the one missing lever of power that they don't have, and that's the presidency. So you have to look at the election as a tool, towards a larger strategy by these hardcore radicals who are very close, have a great affinity to the People's Republic of China. And amazingly enough, at least for people who don't follow it much, they have a strong affinity for North Korea. But that election was high stakes for them and for everyone else. Well, they won the election, depending on how you determine it. Wasn't an honest election. Nothing that I saw suggested to me that it was. And actually, I've been following South Korean elections in detail since 2020. So this is the fourth one that I've seen. And you have the same problems raised by South Korean patriots who try to get the word out and who are very active in trying to monitor what's going on in their own country. And they have raised the same issues, presented similar evidence, in some cases even more evidence this time around, and they tried their best. But you can see what the outcome was. Now, when I said that the hardcore radicals in South Korea are trying to take over all the levers of power, if you actually step back, you will see from about 10 years ago, they have systematically gone about getting these elements of control, the organizations, the institutions that you use to control the country. And that includes, in particular, the media. They have completely neutered it. So there really is no honest investigative media in South Korea. They have got academia, of course, that's a given. The labor unions, the judiciary is heavily subverted. The police, the same thing. The National Intelligence Service, they've got problems as well. And they have put big business, Samsung, Lotte, these companies, they put them on notice that the government is going to run things, or at least is going to exert extreme control. And that's been going on for a while. And the military as well has been put on notice with the prosecution a few years back of one of the top South Korean generals for abuse of power. The charges were thrown out, but the message was delivered, and it was received. So there was only one thing left, as I said, and that was the presidency. In addition to, and I also forgot to mention, they have the National Assembly with an overwhelming control of it. They've got about 189 of 300 seats, and they have gradually built up that strength, starting with the 2020 election. And then they built it up again even further in 2024. And as I noted, each of these elections has been marred by not just minor fraud, but I would say determinative electoral wrongdoing. And they have used that, as I said, to get the National Assembly. And when you have the National Assembly, which is like our Congress, when you have that in South Korea, you have a lot more power over the president, and you can pretty much handcuff him so that he cannot govern. He's got very little power if the National Assembly does not cooperate or uses its power. Actually, in the case of the most recent president, Yoon, who was impeached, they impeached him or his officials to almost 30 times in the 2 years he was in office. 30 times. It was just routine. And it was, as President Yoon referred to it, was legislative dictatorship. And it was that bad. So thinking he had no option, President Yoon actually declared martial law. And he withdrew the declaration fairly shortly after, in accordance with constitutional procedures, but the damages had been done, and he tried everything else, and that was his last option. So it wasn't as if he woke up one morning and said, let's try martial law to take over the entire country, but rather it was a last-ditch effort to try to wake people up as to what these radicals, these leftists in South Korea were doing. And I would note, their party is called the Democratic Party of Korea. Now, what sort of evidence is it that we saw? Well, it was the usual, the hard copy, the analog sort of fraud. You have stacks of pristine ballots, absolutely pristine, all marked for the same guy. And you can guess who that was. And by Korean law, you actually have to fold a ballot when you vote. They were just brand new, stacks of them, photos of it, and a lot of them. And there was when in the election before, when the same thing happened, when the National Election Commission, which is another lever of power that the radicals have, when this was brought to their attention, what they said was, well, we use a special paper, and when you crumple it up, it springs back to just perfection. All the wrinkles go away. And they'd never have been very good at getting their story straight, but this is one example. You had actually citizens watching the polls in South Korea this time, and particularly this time, and other times as well, and actually counting the number of people who go into polling stations and comparing that with the number of votes announced by the National Election Commission as having come from that station. And it's always, in almost every case that they checked, and there was a lot of them, the numbers were inflated considerably. And I think 20% or higher. And if you just do the math, you have people who are voting in those stations as one vote every like 4.5 seconds. And that is physically impossible. to do, and so that you get that evidence. There's something called early voting, and that means that, and this is important because 2 to 3 days before the election, or 3 or 4 days before the actual election day, South Koreans can vote. The polls are open. And what has happened in every election since 2020 is that the number of votes for the Democratic Party candidates, this is the Congress, or in the case of the presidency, it was the same thing, but the number of votes for them on early voting is huge, and the number of votes for the conservative candidate, in this case called the PPP, is very small. It's this huge gap. And then you have actual voting day, and the numbers are the announced numbers are very, very close, and they are closer, and the conservative candidate is ahead. But it's much, much closer. It's what you would get normally according to statistical probability. And the early voting is sort of the equivalent of our mail-in votes, where you've got the time between the so-called casting of the vote and the counting. And that's where real fraud takes place. And it has been done. And this is where you have a situation where the guys who are rigging the election can actually try to get their calculations straight, know how many votes they need, and they create such a gap on early voting that it's almost impossible to overcome. But there's another catch here, and I mentioned analog fraud, and that is the paper ballots, the people who are spotted voting 6 times using fake IDs, and there's just many cases of this. But there's an electronic aspect to this, and the National Election Commission system is so simple that really high schoolers in China could probably hack the thing without breaking a sweat. It's basically a couple servers at the NEC attached that connect to every polling site. And this is not hard. In 2020, it was revealed that Huawei, the Chinese company's components, were actually in this and appear to still be. And the NEC was told of this, was warned of it, and they said it's irrelevant. And then the NEC declared that their system was unhackable. Now, these are either really stupid people or else they're in on the fix. And I think it's actually probably some of both, because nepotism is the name of the game at the NEC. But more to the point, after it was declared unhackable in October 2023, it was possible for the National Intelligence Service to have a chance to examine the National Election Commission in South Korea's systems. And they ran wild, and they put a list of the things that you could do, all of which would allow you to determine the outcome of an election. And it was a scathing report. And yet nothing much was done to fix that. But the point is, you've got an electronic system that's extremely vulnerable, and ultimately, and there's a Chinese tie in there, and you can actually determine who's going to win. There's they do have there's some limit, only in the sense that they want to make it look good. But that is how vulnerable this system is. It's why there's so little confidence in it. You also had sound trucks going around for the DP, Democratic Party candidates, in some places that were announcing how to vote in Chinese. You figure that out. Additionally, you have an overseas vote this year that was huge. It was about 2 times more than it ever is. Supposedly, it went about 80–90% for the radical candidate, for Lee Jae-myung. And you also didn't really have to show that you were a South Korean citizen to vote that way. So the bottom line here, it was just rife with fraud. And this should not have really been recognized as a legitimate outcome. The South Korean government has been presented with this evidence in this election and every other election by just the most committed Korean Democrats, sort of patriots, put it that way, who want to save their democracy. And in every case, they are dismissed, ignored, ostracized, in some cases prosecuted for calling for an honest election in South Korea. It is that bad. It's like something straight out of the old Soviet Union or East Germany. And now here's where we get to the US government response to all of this. In the run-up to this election, there were people just desperate for any sort of a statement from the Americans of passing reference to the work they were doing and just the importance of having an honest, consensual government, fair elections, and democracy in South Korea, both to bolster the good guys and to put the bad guys on notice. They just wanted a statement from USG, particularly from President Trump. They got nothing. Shortly after the election results were announced, the White House and the State Department each congratulated the winner, Lee Jae-myung, for his victory, and they said the election was free and fair. It was a free and fair election. And I don't know who was behind this, but what this did, it really, this hurt. It gives the government that won the new administration that won by just clear fraud. It gives them the ability to say to anyone who challenges them in South Korea, well, look, the US government said it was free and fair. I don't know why they said this. They certainly did not examine any evidence. And if there maybe there's another South Korea out there that I've never heard of. But this was a huge misstep. And I really cannot overstate. It's going to be hard to recover from it. I think there's things that you can do. But this was, to put it mildly, disappointing. It's something I would have expected actually from the so-called adults of the previous administration. But this one, they did not perform well at all. And I feel sorry for the South Koreans who were defending their country, wanted nothing more than just a couple words of sort of appreciation from the administration, and they got nothing. So there we are. And that sets up some of the background, and I can answer later more specific questions. But what you saw here, I hope it wasn't the last step in a South Korean democracy. From now on, yes, there'll be elections, but you know how they're going to end. You have the leftists in control, the leaders of power, particularly the National Assembly and the presidency. And the rest of South Korea is very worried. But we'll see what happens. They may not sit quietly and go down without a fight. So thanks very much, Frank.
Thank you, Colonel Newsham. As always, an extraordinarily detailed and insightful analysis, born of your firsthand field investigation, not least. I think your point about it being rife with fraud and something that might have been attenuated by engagement by the United States is indeed of surpassing importance, and we'll visit with you about that a bit more in a moment. Before we do, though, we're going to turn next to another of our very frequent contributors to these programs. We have, as is often the case, him by video, and I'm trying just now to pull up my notes on Sam Faddis's presentation. Sam is, of course, a recovering Central Intelligence Agency undercover operative. I don't mean that facetiously. I mean that he has been in from the cold for some time, but distinguished himself for some 20 years, working in some very dangerous places on behalf of our country, and has been as mindful and as, I think, astute about what's happened to the intelligence capabilities of this country in the period, particularly, I think, since he came back out of public service and into the private realm. His current gig is the really incredibly helpful online resource called AndMagazine. You can find it at substack.com. It is a kind of running commentary and analysis on many of the topics that we address here, and we are profoundly grateful for his work in that space. We have asked Sam to talk a bit about both what has gone on in this election in South Korea, but also the failure of the intelligence community to, at a minimum, provide the kind of insights into what was coming down, it appears, so that policymakers might have mobilized themselves to make the sort of statement that Colonel Newsham referred to. That's the best case. The worst case is that they are now in such a dire state that they were unable to play the kind of role that, as he'll talk about, the agency, even in its formative moments, did in trying to preserve the free world in the face of Soviet efforts to take it down, notably in Italy in 1948. Let's go to Sam Faddis on the question of beyond repair, the appalling state of U.S. covert capabilities and the real world cost of allowing them to atrophy in time of war. This is a clip from an interview that I did with him for our Securing America program this morning. As you'll see, I'm a minute at the back end, but it's a very, very insightful discussion of these important aspects of the problem. Over to Sam Faddis and State now.
When we talk about what just happened in South Korea, right, these elections, from the context of, I look at it in sort of through the lens of what's it telling us about our human intelligence capabilities, both in the sense of collection and in the sense of influencing events on the ground. And, you know, up front, not suggesting we should be in the business of stealing elections and installing puppets, but the point is, I think what we're looking at is somebody else has done that pretty effectively in South Korea, right under our noses. We're watching the Chinese communists do that. We have watched them. So what's that tell us about our capabilities, our intelligence capabilities, and, more specifically, the Central Intelligence Agency? Because this whole business of what would technically be covert action countering Chinese efforts is precisely in their wheelhouse, right? Where I think it puts us is this: it's crunch time, right? It's reality has intruded. You can stand up on Capitol Hill in front of a committee as a representative of the agency and yammer and produce PowerPoint presentations and talk all day about the cool neato stuff you're doing and how you're running ads to recruit Chinese assets online and all of this stuff. And that's all wonderful, but it's kind of like the equivalent of a sporting event, or when I used to do trial work. Eventually, you got to actually put up or shut up. You have to actually produce. You can just keep talking, but the truth will out, if you will. And I think that's what we just saw in South Korea. When you talk about intelligence operations, you often hear people talk about denied areas, and they could be very different. So Moscow would be one where you better have your stuff together, and it's very difficult to securely handle an asset there. Kabul would be also a denied area in a very different sense. You're not going to get arrested, you're going to get killed. South Korea is really, for us, should be at the other end of the spectrum. I don't mean to say that intelligence operations are ever without risk or easy, but let's be real. We've been in South Korea for decades. It owes its existence to us. We have a massive defense presence. We have interaction with them at every level of the government, commercial interaction. There are lots and lots of Americans there and lots of Koreans, and complete freedom of interaction and so forth. So that's kind of the definition of what I would call a permissive environment. Not pretending that there's ever an environment where you can just get away with murder, but okay, this is not Moscow, guys. Once upon a time in South Korea, you couldn't have dropped a pin anywhere in South Korea without the CIA knowing about it. And, without stepping over any lines into the realm of classified, if there was a significant meeting going on at some level in the South Korean government, one would assume a large number of the individuals in the room were in one way or the other talking to us. and working with us to the benefit of South Korea. So the idea that the Chinese communists can come into that kind of environment, build this capability, which obviously doesn't happen you don't do that in a couple of weeks. This is a sustained effort year after year after year. The idea that they can do that, and we are surprised by it, it happens, and we don't counter it, and it brings to mind, I mean, there are historic examples of when that was not the case, right? Very sort of at the birth of the CIA right after the Second World War, famously, the Russians were on the precipice via the Italian communists of taking Italy, a Western European nation, very much on our side of the Iron Curtain, and turning it communist. That was a real thing. And had it happened historically, potentially would have unhinged NATO completely. It wouldn't have just been Italy from there. And the CIA stopped that from happening. I think enough of that is declassified that we can just say that outright at this point. The Central Intelligence Agency prevented Italy from becoming a communist nation and falling. And now we see that apparently we no longer have that capacity and that capability. And it brings to mind a couple of things. One is this continuing drumbeat that we're seeing. Drumbeat is not strong enough. This continuing, it's yet another example of the extent to which the Chinese have established what amounts to this covert action capability. And they're using it inside the United States. And then how we're not responding to this. There's no counter to this. We're not effectively standing up. I think it ought to set off alarm bells, I guess, where I leave this is not just in regard to South Korea, which, good Lord, that's already catastrophic enough to our defense posture in all of East Asia and so forth. But if this kind of thing is possible in South Korea, good Lord, we are really flat on our backs worldwide. So who knows what else is about to happen to us. I would hope we are going to see a dramatic reaction. I will hope that is the case. Right now, I have not seen the signs that we have awakened and that we're doing anything significant at CIA, but we need to in a hurry.
Would you assess that perhaps because the CIA's condition, policymakers in the Trump administration did not adequately understand what was at stake here and the possibility of losing South Korea? I
think you're exactly right. That Chinese just did this to us in South Korea, and we not only didn't counter it, we didn't know it was going to happen, which is devastating.
That's putting a fair and I think fine point on it. And thank you, Sam Faddis, for doing so as always. We're going to talk next about how what has happened in South Korea is not an isolated event, that there is what I'm calling a, tectonic trifecta for the CCP. And who better to talk to about the Chinese political warfare that has seemingly helped to subvert elections, not just in South Korea, as we've been told by Grant and by Sam, but in Canada and Australia as well. We're tapping, for the purpose, a man who hails from a Pacific island originally. His name is Trevor Loudon. Again, he's been extremely generous with his time and analysis and insights for these programs. He is from New Zealand originally. He has made his life's work to try to save his adopted country, the United States. most especially by bringing to bear his deep understanding and encyclopedic knowledge about enemies within. That's the title of a book and film he's made. Enemies Within the Church is another film. He's got several other important books to his credit, multi-volume sets about the United States Senate entitled Security Risks Senators, and the House of Representatives entitled House Un-Americans. His most recent book is actually about Australia, one of the topics we've asked him to address. Comrade Prime Minister is its title, about the history of Anthony Albanese's 40-year alliance with communism, including that of China. The specific request is that that Trevor will take a look at the possibility that as those plates have shifted tectonically, we may see, as I mentioned earlier, something of a tsunami that might perhaps engulf Taiwan and maybe even us. Trevor Loudon, welcome back. It's so good to have you, sir. Glad to turn the floor over to you now.
Well, thanks very much, Frank. And I want to concur with Sam's point. The CIA is not only not countering the communist takeover of several friendly countries, not just South Korea, but doesn't even seem to be aware of it, or if it is being prevented in passing that information on to the president. And I will deal with that later in my talk. But Canada, for a start. Okay, Canada, the Canadian Security Intelligence Service released a report in 2009 saying the Chinese Communist Party at that point had taken over the state governments of both British Columbia and Alberta, Canada's richest provinces. So they had that much control back in 2009 because there was a massive influx of Hong Kong Chinese into British Columbia and Alberta after Hong Kong was turned over to China in 1997, I think it was. And that brought with them the communists and organized crime, who are basically in partnership now. There was much controversy, not the last election, but the election before in Canada, about 20 Canadian seats where Chinese students were illegally voting in favor of Justin Trudeau's Liberal Party. And there was credible reports that the Chinese students and the Chinese poll watchers in those districts were basically flipped 20 seats in Trudeau's direction at that time. Now you have Prime Minister Carney, who is making some strong noises against China, but he's an alumni, a very senior official of the World Economic Forum, which is completely in China's pocket, and is a very hardcore leftist in his own right. Now, President Trump was not warned about this because President Trump, like at the beginning of this year, it became clear that Justin Trudeau was on the way out. He was extremely unpopular, and Poilievre, the Conservative candidate, was leading by 20 points in Canada. Now, so then Trudeau is ousted, Carney takes over, and President Trump endorses Carney, and then basically gets in a big fight with Canada about making Canada the 51st state and putting big tariffs on Canada. That flipped the election absolutely beyond doubt to the Liberals, to the left. So now, because President Trump had no sound advice on this, he endorsed the bad guy and did things that helped flip the election, which was certain to be won by the Conservative, into the Chinese camp. So that's Canada. Now, Mexico, by the way, has had two communist presidents in a row, Obrador and now Sheinbaum. And I don't think President Trump is remotely aware that either of these people are communists. So, they are very friendly to China, very friendly to Russia, Hezbollah, whatever. They might be being nice to Trump now, because Schaumburg might be nice because she has to be, but they will betray us in any chance they get. But going to Australia, now I wrote my book, and I hope people will get it. It's called Comrade Prime Minister Anthony Albanese's 40-year alliance with Australian communism. Now, Anthony Albanese is not a liberal. He's not a progressive. He's not even a socialist. He's a hardcore communist as Che Guevara. He's been active with the communist movement in Australia for 40 years. First the Communist Party of Australia, then the Communist Party succeeding organisation, which is called the Search Foundation. And he has their people all around him as chief of staff. The second or third most powerful man in Australia is a Search Foundation member. Most of his cabinet are Marxists, including Penny Wong, a Chinese, Malaysian, Australian, who is as radical as he is and loves China like you wouldn't believe, and is dragging Australia into the Chinese orbit. Recently, Secretary of Defence Hegseth had a meeting with the Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, Richard Marles, I think it was in Singapore, and asked Australia to up their defence spending in light of the Chinese threat. Albanese flatly refused and said, we will handle our own defence spending, please, exactly as I predicted he would. And he is going to, look, we've got to understand, Australia is one of the Five Eyes, as is Canada. Very, very critical. Pine Gap is there. There's an extensive US military presence there. Australia is critical for the defence of the South Pacific should hostilities break out. And it's a very useful American base, a listening post, a gateway to Antarctica, the Southern Oceans. It's very strategically placed. And now it's basically run by a guy who likes China far better than he likes America. And again, at the beginning of this year, Anthony Albanese was only re-elected on May the 3rd for a second term. Beginning of this year, the Conservatives were winning. The Conservatives were ahead. The pro-American Conservatives were ahead. But then the talk of tariffs came in. Then that galvanized the Australian left and a lot of moderate voters, and Albanese was returned with record margins. There was a very interestingly as well, there's a 6% of 6% of Australian voters are Chinese nationals. No, 600, no, way more than that. It's about 3%. There's over 600,000 Chinese nationals voting in Australia. And they did a 30% swing to the Australian Labor Party, Albanese's party, in the last election. That is unheard of. They swung 30% because China made it very, very clear. They called Albanese the handsome boy. They made it very clear who they wanted to be Prime Minister of Australia, and the Chinese responded. And the 30% of Australians are foreign born. 30%. 30% of Australian voters are foreign born, many from China or third world countries, who all lean left. And I think about 2 million of those came in the last election term. So you can guess that immigration is going to be amped up in the second term Albanese. The people, and this might seem total hyperbole and totally crazy, but the people in the left in Australia, they believe that Anthony Albanese will bring in communism in Australia in his second term. Seriously. Now, I think Grant Newsham talked about in South Korea. Sam talked about Italy in 1948, how the CIA stopped Italy going communist. Well, Australia almost went communist in 1949, and it was only a very staunch effort by Australian anti-communists that prevented that. So don't think Australia can't come under Chinese control, because it already halfway is, probably more than that. Anthony, the previous government of Australia under Scott Morrison, the Conservative, was very strongly anti-China, tried to shut down the Confucius Institutes, etc. Albanese stopped that. Penny Wong stopped that. There is very little criticism of China in the Australian press. Australia is in deep trouble, which means America is in deep trouble, because we need Australia, let alone New Zealand, my home country, we need Australia to fight, to be on our side against China. And that's going to affect the Philippines. This is going to affect Taiwan. This is going to affect India, Indonesia, all of them. You've got South Korea going under communist control, and Australia run by a pro-Chinese communist. Now, I'll just talk a little bit about South Korea, because I know something about this. The Democratic Party of South Korea has been making big inroads into the Democratic Party of America in the last few years, through people like Kim, the Korean senator from New Jersey, Marilyn Strickland, the half Korean congresswoman from Washington State, etc. They have been cultivating American Democratic politicians. We've also got a big pro-North Korean contingent in this country through groups like No Dut Dole and others, who have been promoting the North Korean cause for some time. What I've been noticing the last couple of years is the pro-Democratic Party factions here and the pro-North Korean factions here have been working together, something you did not see until the last couple of years. And I'll just mention that the head of the pro-North Korean faction here is a woman called Christine Ahn, very strong lobbyist. She's been to North Korea multiple times, lobbies congressmen all the time. And in my book, White House Reds, I did a chapter on Tulsi Gabbard. And here is, you won't see it here, but here's a picture of Tulsi Gabbard with Christine Ahn, the North Korean agent. And there are other pictures in the book. There is a relationship between Tulsi Gabbard, who is now Trump's Director of National Intelligence, and Christine Ahn, as Tulsi Gabbard has also had connections to Venezuelans, to all sorts of foreign hostile actors. So she is now Director of National Intelligence. Is it any wonder that Trump is being blindsided? Could there be a connection here? Could there be a reason that Trump had seemingly no knowledge of what was looming in South Korea, though multiple people here have been trying to warn him? But who edits his intelligence? I think this is a question that needs to be deeply studied, because we've had several foreign policy disasters this year, none of which needed to happen if the president and the CIA were working in the right direction.
Thank you, Trevor. And I think by CIA, you mean the intelligence community rather more broadly. Yeah, as well.
16 agencies. Well, as Sam says, we could stop communist revolutions. Now we don't even seem to be aware of them.
Or, and this is something we'll maybe tease out in the Q&A, we are aware of them and indifferent to the implications of them. It's another rather disconcerting possibility. Our final presenter, also a very familiar face of these programs, is Captain James Fennell, United States Navy retired. He has been, in the course of his distinguished naval intelligence career, the chief of intelligence and information operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He is now with the Geneva Center for Security Policy and a very active participant in the public policy debate about all of these issues, notably in his role as a Committee on the Present-Danger China member, contributor to Steve Bannon's program War Room, and of course mine as well. Indeed, the video that we're going to see with him is from an interview that we did yesterday, I believe, on, among other things, this issue of South Korea, and specifically, what do we do now? The question put in the vernacular is, can we make lemonade out of the rather vast strategic lemon that we now have received from the Chinese Communist Party in South Korea? Let's go to the videotape with Captain Fennell at this point.
This was an election that was heavily influenced and manipulated in a conspiracy, I would say, with the Chinese Communist Party and leftist communist sympathizers in the South Korean political sphere. And they were able to conduct what Grant and others have said is election interference, and they've got the receipts for that. And I think that needs to be looked into by the United States in terms of how fair that was. But it's done, and it is what it is. To give you a sense on the reaction, the Chinese Communist press, their party organs have come out in the last 2 days since the election results and praised the new president, praised the new reset, praised the fact that they're going to reestablish their relations. The Korea Herald, which is a left-leaning newspaper in Seoul, said they noted previously that Lee's diplomatic pragmatism has signaled, quote, a reset of strategic compass for the country's foreign and North Korea policy, suggesting that he rejected being, quote, boxed into binary choices. So what they're doing is they're basically saying that the previous choices, the previous relationships between the U.S. and South Korea was a binary choice, and it limited their ability to resolve the peninsula situation. So now they're going to go back to engagement with the Chinese Communist Party, back to six-party talks, back to trying to appease Kim Jong-un in order to get some kind of mythical deal. And we know over time that that's not worked. And what jumped out to me in the reading of the news and whatnot was it was only since 1992 that South Korea recognized Communist China. Since we've switched recognition in 1979, but South Korea waited until 1992. And now here in the space of just 33 years, we've gone from a country that was a staunch U.S. ally that had close to, at that time, 50,000+ American soldiers and sailors and airmen on the peninsula defending them against North Korea and Kim Jong-un's father and grandfather. But now we have an administration that's seeking to say, yeah, let's forget all that because that didn't work, and let's try to make some agreement. And they've done that in the past, and at each time that they've done that, we've seen the North Koreans react aggressively, build up their nuclear arsenal and capabilities, build up their military, and we know that the Chinese Communist Party is engaged with Russia to help foment this. So what you have now is a real threat that the ultimate goal of Xi and the Chinese Communist Party is to drive the U.S. military out of Asia, to drive us back to Hawaii and back to the West Coast so that they can dominate the global economy, they can dominate all of our allies, and we become a vassal state in some way if they allow us that. They don't want to use force if they don't have to, and in this case, they were able to take Hong Kong just a few years ago. They've taken Tibet. They take the Xinjiang through these other means, and now they're in the process of maybe taking South Korea. And so it's really important that this administration redouble our efforts to remain forward. Secretary of Defense Hegseth in Singapore last week said that one of the critical elements of his policy in the Far East was going to be remain forward. So let's hope that we do that. We'll have to deal with this new leader. We don't want to alienate him like we maybe alienated Putin and drove him into the arms of Xi. So we have to work extra hard. Our diplomats have to be extra smart in trying to show this new leader that what he gets from a relationship with the United States is better than a relationship with Xi and Kim Jong-un. Folks that are on the left, that follow this kind of leftist ideology, they're constantly, I think, and maybe it's on the right too, but this idea of legacy and I want to leave a legacy. So there's this drive to say I did something. And we saw what happened when somebody tried to do that in August of 2021, to artificially create an end of a conflict in Afghanistan. It was a disaster, and it's still a disaster. And so we need to be very, very clear-eyed about not giving in to Kim Jong-un, not giving in to Xi Jinping, not allowing them to drive a false deal that suggests peace and stability when it actually expands chaos and coercion. Whether we like it or not, we've been in an armistice since 1953, okay? And that armistice has kept things peaceful for the most part. There's been a couple of little flare-ups here and there, but for the most part, That arrangement has kept the peace. Now, we have to pay for it. We got to put troops there. But we work with our Japanese allies very closely. We work with other allies in our NATO hat that come over from Europe. We have a lot of team building there that has kept things safe. And if somebody wants to come in and just, take out one of those little brown pegs at the bottom and the whole thing falls over, we got to be clear-eyed and firm on that. And that's why I kind of said with this new Lee, I don't have any illusions about where he's coming from. I just don't think we need to have a public policy and talk about it in public. We need to get behind closed doors with him and our Japanese allies and start talking real turkey about what's going on. And if there's intelligence that we can share with them or things that can show them that North Korea is not abiding by the things that they're being told by Xi and the Chinese Communist Party, if they hold some kind of trilateral summit or something like that, we need to be really careful about that. It's very, very dangerous.
Very, very dangerous seems to be the leitmotif of all of the things we've talked about. We have time for a question or two from our two presenters who are with us. Colonel Newsham, I don't know that we talked about it explicitly. I think there was some allusion to it, and particularly in what Jim just said. But a hardy perennial of the radical left in South Korea, the North Korean regimes under various generations of the Kim dynasty, the Chinese communists, and for that matter, those who are sympathizers with all of those bad actors here in the United States, that there needs to be a peace treaty between the North and South. We talked about this when you were on our program the other day, but could you give us a flavor of whether that is likely to emerge as a priority initiative of this new Lee presidency in South Korea? And if so, what might come of it, not just with respect to the obvious signatories, North and South of the DMZ, but for our interests as well?
Sure, I think it could be, yes, this could be one line of attack by the new sort of leftist regime in South Korea. And it's been in their toolbox for a long time. They've pushed it, and they've got, as Trevor said, they've got plenty of proxies in America pushing this as well. What happens is that if you sign a rushed force treaty like this, you have undercut the logical reason for American troops being present on the peninsula. And that is going to, that will be pushed by the hardcore leftists saying, well, now we've got a treaty, we don't need you here. And it really has been if not a misreading, an accidental misreading, I think it's probably been intentional in a lot of cases, the failure to understand the nature of South Korean leftists. And you just have to listen to what they say, look at what they do. And these are people who see the North as where South Korea should be aligned, and the Chinese Communist Party similarly. We have just pretended, oh, they're just left, just liberals or on the left side of the spectrum. These are hardcore people, and they are hell-bent on taking the country where most people don't want the country to go. And they have already, and it's important to note this as well, that they have already started the pogrom against their opponents on the conservative side of the spectrum. They're changing the laws so that they can go after them, make life miserable for them, imprison them if necessary, and that was all predictable. And it's starting. They're going to pack their Supreme Court so that they can do whatever they want, and the good guys in South Korea are feeling pretty frightened right now. But with that treaty to end the wars on the peninsula, sounds good in theory, but when you look into it, would ultimately lead to U.S. forces either leaving the peninsula or else causing so much trouble in that relationship that we'd have our hands full just sort of trying to stabilize things in South Korea, much less carrying out any coherent strategy to defend against communism, against China in the region.
I want to come back to that in a moment. Let me just turn to Trevor quickly, though. Trevor, as I said in my introduction, and your comments have borne it out, you've really specialized on this phenomenon of the enemy within, in not just uh, this country, but elsewhere. Um, at this point, would you consider the correlation of forces that the Chinese are now observing in Canada, in Australia, now in South Korea, um, and perhaps, in other places as well? I gather things are in ferment in the Philippines, for example. And our friend Cleo Pascal, who we had hoped might be able to join us, turns out to be out in the islands of the South Pacific at the moment and unavailable to us. But certainly she's been chronicling, as have others of you, um, the extent to which real inroads have been made by the Chinese in the Solomons, for example, among other places. If you were observing all of this from the perspective of Xi Jinping, especially as it relates to Taiwan, uh, and anything you'd like to throw in about the United States as well, for that matter, does this seem to you to be a tipping point, perhaps?
I think it's getting very close to a tipping point. And just to carry on with Grant's point, there's a law being brought up several times in the United States to formally end the Korean War. The coordinator of this effort is Christine Ahn, the leading North Korean agent in the country, the former colleague of Tulsi Gabbard. So the idea is very simple. You have a peace treaty, 28,000 US troops get withdrawn, South Korea becomes a communist country. That's what it is. And that's going to affect Japan. The other thing is, Taiwan only didn't elect the Kuomintang the other day, last election. The Kuomintang is a pro-Chinese party in South Korea because
in Taiwan.
Because of vote splitting. The two pro-China parties split, allowing the anti-China party to come through. Well, we can't guarantee that's going to happen again. So Taiwan could fall just like South Korea is right now. There's a huge communist party in Japan, massive, which has huge influence as well. Just like in Israel, there's a massive communist party in Israel too, which is sabotaging Israel all of the time. But Fiji is pretty much under Chinese control. Most of the Pacific, Samoa is heavily under Chinese influence. So is Vanuatu. So is New Zealand. And the Cook Islands, which is 1,000 miles from New Zealand and technically part of New Zealand, just signed, against the wishes of the New Zealand government, a massive minerals exploration deal with China, giving them control over 1,000 miles of seabed around the Cook Islands, or access to 1,000 miles, which is going to expand the Chinese presence in the South Pacific tremendously. So if you add up the dominoes, you've got huge Chinese presence in Mexico, you've got huge Chinese presence in Canada, South Korea, big communist presence in Japan, big Chinese presence in Taiwan. Australia's problematic. New Zealand is slightly problematic, and many of the Pacific Islands are highly problematic. And Philippines has also got a big problem with a major Chinese-backed communist insurrection going on there. So unless we get proactive in turning the tide here, unless President Trump is out loud pushing this back, we're going to lose domino after domino after domino, and not even be aware of it half the time.
Very, very daunting prospect there. Grant, you have spent a lot of time in Japan, serving there, as I mentioned earlier, I think both in the Marine Corps as well as in the embassy, as in business. Trevor's just described potential fifth column, I guess I'd put it that way, a communist party in Japan. More generally, especially given the very, very profound hostility of President Lee to the Japanese, would you anticipate that they're calculating that maybe this is a time for a separate peace, or are they likely to be further fortified by the prospect of these dynamics that Trevor's just described?
Well, I think the Japanese are once again pulling their hair out over what goes on with the Koreans. They would like to get along better with South Korea. At least I'd say the sensible part of the Japan's ruling class. They would like to, and it's really up to South Korea. But this is going to be used. The Japan thing is going to be used by South Korea's leftists, really to pillory anyone who tries to say, well, let's get along with the Japanese. It's always used effectively as a political tool. And the progress that has been made in recent years with the South Koreans and the Japanese getting along better and cooperating militarily and on the intelligence front, I think that is all very much at risk. It's worth noting that when President Yoon, the previous conservative president, was impeached, the original charges, one of the big ones was he was too nice to Japan. And that gives you something of how this new government is going to play things. One thing about Japan that's worth noting is that with the citizenry, there's a real sort of dislike of China. But in the ruling class, the subversion is immense, and particularly in the political class. I would just throw out a figure, maybe 40% of Japan's Diet, which is their Congress, has probably got closer ties to China than should be the case. There's been instances where Japanese lawmakers, large numbers of them, go over onto China on study tours. And you can guess what comes out of that. So that's a huge problem there. Additionally, there's Japanese officialdom, the business class as well, which is pretty darn soft on China and thinks that Japan should give them what they want. So we think Japan is solid, and in some ways it is, but in others, there's some real risk there, particularly if the rest of the region sort of goes under.
Thank you. Let me conclude with a quick question to both of you. Might not be quick answers, but I hope they will be because we've got to wrap up. President Trump, of course, yesterday had an hour-and-a-half conversation with Xi Jinping. And we're told that they didn't talk about much other than trade, and that there's now going to be a home-and-home visit by the two leaders to the other's country. Could you, gentlemen, give me your crystal ball assessment of whether this will further undermine the sense that we had been hoping, and our Committee on the Present Danger of China certainly espouses, of heightened awareness of the threats that the Chinese Communist Party represents to all of us, and may once again induce the sense that engagement is the order of the day with China, and that the allies will be further encouraged to, accommodate the Chinese rather than join us in resisting what they may be up to. Let's start with you, Trevor. We'll go to Grant last.
Yeah, I think it's a big mistake. I think it will empower the left in Korea, in Japan, Australia, all over the Pacific. I think the heavy tariffs on China, the decoupling from China is the way to go. It's the only way to go. And President Trump, this is what I keep coming back to. I think there are people around President Trump who are deliberately sabotaging an America First policy and distorting the intelligence product that he gets to this is second-term Trump on foreign policy is very different from first-term Trump, because I think there are people around him, and I've named one of them, I think, who are moving things in the wrong direction, and this is an example of this going forward.
Thank you, Trevor. Grant, your thoughts?
Well, I agree with Trevor. I think there's a real danger that we're headed back to just business as usual. And the people who sort of want to sell out to China, that's all the encouragement they need. So I don't think there's a deal to be cut. I don't think there's any, and even if you did, the Chinese wouldn't follow it. You simply got to decouple and get away as far away from the Chinese communists as you can. But we are seeing somewhat the outcome of 30 years of this dependency that's been built up without the people who should have saying anything. So that I think that the tool that the Chinese communists have with rare earth exports to the United States has given them a lot more leverage than they would otherwise have. But this easing up on China and talking to them with intention of cutting a deal, that's just crazy. What we get from China is fentanyl and famine. If you look at that, the latest arrest of the Chinese researcher in Michigan with that biological pathogen, we don't get anything from them, and the quicker that we get away from them, the better off we will be.
Yeah. Pathogens is something we do get from them, as well as you say, chemical warfare, the fentanyl kind. This has been a very troubling conversation. Often, I'm afraid the insights that we provide are worrying. We think it's important that they be shared, however, with the American people, because knowing what we're up against offers us an opportunity to make informed decisions about how to proceed. The willful blindness problem, which has been mentioned here several times, is going to contribute, I'm afraid, to very dismal policy failures and possibly very serious strategic consequences. I'm much given to say that at the moment, the definition of the term America First seems to be increasingly up for grabs. When President Trump first advanced it, I remember there were those who were pointing out that it has a rather bad pedigree, what you might call the Lindbergh America Firsters. For Charles Lindbergh, who used it as a vehicle for not simply promoting isolationism, but also accommodation or even appeasement of Adolf Hitler. We've been assured that President Trump has a different interpretation of that. I think the first term of his presidency indicated as much, and some of what he has done has as well in the second term. But it is incumbent on all of us who are attentive to what is happening here, to, in the most constructive way possible, I would recommend, challenge decisions that are being made or actions that are being made without a formal decision being taken, or simply by inaction, that are, in fact, as our concluding two panelists have said, contributing to the idea that the Chinese are almost certainly taking away from these developments, that their strategy is winning, that America is indeed a declining power. They are indeed a rising power. And while we didn't get into it on this occasion, we have on any number of other ones, there's reason for the Chinese to be very concerned about what's going on at home. And it is incumbent upon us, I believe, to intensify those problems in the hopes that the Chinese people will have a shot at freeing themselves from this horrific Chinese Communist Party regime that has brutalized and mass murdered them and seeks to do the same to us. So with the hope that this has been bracing and inspiring of action on the part of all of you who are either with us at the moment or will see this video in the future, please join us at presentdangerchina.org. We have a take action item there. We have incredible content, including the fruits of these kinds of conversations, over 200, I think 10 now, many of them featuring the wonderful folks that we have featured in the course of the program today. Grant Newsham, Sam Faddis, Trevor Loudon, and of course Captain James Fennell. We're deeply in their debt, and to you as well, for being with us. Please, as I'm fond of saying, go forth and multiply. This video will be available shortly, and we hope you will share it widely. In the meantime, God bless you. God bless our country. Back to you, Didi.
Thanks, Frank. A video of this webinar will be posted to Present Danger China, generally within a day of our program's conclusion. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. For webinar notices, updates, and news, subscribe to our Substack at presentdangerchina.substack.com and follow us on X at CPD China. Join us again next week for another installment of our Committee on the Present Danger China webinar series on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how CCP captured elites betray the USA. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.